In this lecture, we're going to discuss why cells have to remain small, and we're going to tackle some of the formulas on the AP formula sheet that have to do with calculating surface area and volume and calculating surface to volume ratio. So let me ask, why are you a multicellular organism? Why are you about 100 trillion cells big? How come you are not just one big giant cell that weighs about 140 pounds? The reason why has to do with a cell's surface to volume ratio. And the surface to volume ratio changes as a cell gets bigger. Now, cells have to exchange materials with the environment, and they exchange that through their cell membrane. They have to take in nutrients, and they have to get rid of waste. In order to efficiently exchange materials with the environment, cells have to have a high surface to volume ratio. So I want you to put stars around high, put arrows at it. It's important for you to remember that cells have to have a high surface to volume ratio. Now let's look at an analogy so that you can see why cells are limited in their size. Let's say that you got a job and you work in a huge building, and that building is 1 mile by 1 mile, and your desk is in the very center of the building. Now, it's important that you receive materials and you send out materials to do your job. So imagine if a delivery came to the building. So here's the package that you need, and someone has to walk that package to your desk, or you have to go and get that package. If you think about that, that would probably take someone about 6 minutes to reach your desk. Now, let's compare that to if you work in a building that's the size of our classroom. So again, your desk is in the very center of the classroom, and a package arrives at the door, and you would have that package in about 4 seconds. So in this situation, this big building has a low surface to volume ratio. And the classroom has a high surface to volume ratio. Now let's make sure you understand the concept of surface area and of volume. So imagine this square is a box, and if I feel the outside of the box, I'm running my hand over the surface. So that entire area that I can touch, that's the outside of the box, is what's considered the surface area. So let's indicate surface area. The surface area is represented by the outside of this box. For volume, imagine putting your hand inside of the box, and all the air that your hand comes in contact with is making up the volume of the box. So all the area inside is representing the volume. When we say surface to volume ratio, that's giving you an idea of the equation to calculate surface to volume ratio. This means surface area divided by volume. We're going to talk about surface to volume ratios a lot throughout the school year, but now we're just focusing on that in relation to cells. And we already mentioned that organelles can have folded membranes, and that helps increase their surface to volume ratio. So it increases the surface area where different reactions can take place. When relating this to the size of cells, smaller cells have a higher surface to volume ratio compared to bigger cells. And that's what cells need in order to efficiently exchange materials with the environment. A high surface to volume ratio results in cells that have enough surface area to efficiently exchange materials that are needed by the volume of the cell, the contents of the cell. And what we mean by the contents of the cell, we're talking about organelles. In the cytoplasm, there's reactions that need to take place. So the cell needs certain molecules brought in so that these reactions can take place. And all of these molecules needed by the cell have to be brought in through the surface area, through the cell membrane. A big cell with a low surface to volume ratio cannot effectively exchange materials that are needed by all the contents of the cell. There's simply going to be too much cell content, and all that content is needing materials. And the cell membrane can't hold that demand of bringing in the needed materials and getting rid of the needed waste when the volume of the cell is really large. For our analogy, we talked about the package is being walked to your desk, or you're walking to go get the package. But in a cell, materials are moved by the process of diffusion. Molecules move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Now, diffusion is a really slow process, and it's a very inefficient way to deliver materials over large distances. But over short distances, it's efficient enough. So let's relate that to another example. Let's say that you want to deliver a note to another student in the room, and I know now that you just text them, but about 50 years ago, whenever I was young, we hand wrote a note and we passed it. The note's written, and you decide to put it in a balloon. This balloon is going to float around the room, and eventually it's going to end up at the person that you wanted to pass the note to. Now, let's compare that with there's a person sitting in the front office, and you want to send a note to them. Imagine how inefficient it would be if you put that note in a balloon and you just rely on that balloon eventually making its way to the office just by chance. So you can see this method is efficient over short distances, like between people in a classroom, but it's going to be very inefficient over long distances. And that's what's going on in this case with diffusion. Now let's get into some calculations involving surface to volume ratio. And again, here's the equation that I indicated earlier. To calculate surface to volume ratio, you're just going to calculate the surface area and divide that by the volume that you calculated. Here's an important concept to grasp. Notice that we have a cube, and this cube is increasing in size. And so here the surface area of each cube is calculated, and then you also have the volume already calculated for these cubes. Notice as the cell grows, surface area is increasing. So let's indicate that. Let's write SA increases. And of course, so does volume. So let's indicate that. So let's write volume increases, but we're going to add at a greater rate. Notice for these first two cells how volume is catching up to the surface area as we increase the size of this cube. So here volume is about 1/3 of the surface area, but as the cell gets bigger, volume is more about 2/3 of the surface area. When you get to this third cube, you see that volume is equal to surface area. And then for the bigger cube, you can see that volume surpasses surface area. Now, the reason why this occurs is because when you calculate surface area, you're squaring a number. When you have a number and it represents surface area, that's why we're going to put units, and we put that square behind it. When you calculate volume, you're cubing numbers. So we report the units of volume with a 3 cubed. If you're squaring a number, it's going to increase. But if you're cubing that same number, it's going to increase at a greater rate. As a cell grows, both surface area and volume increases, but volume increases faster than surface area. Now, let's take a second to calculate surface to volume ratio for each of these cubes and see how surface to volume ratio is changing as a cell gets bigger, or as this cube gets bigger. So again, for surface to volume ratio, you take surface area divided by volume. So the surface to volume ratio for the first cell is 3. 96 divided by 64 is 1.5. 216 divided by 216 is 1. And I believe that number is 384 on top for surface area. But for the last cube, if we take 384 divided by 512, then our surface to volume ratio is 0.75. So these numbers down here are showing you as a cell, or as this cube is getting bigger, the surface to volume ratio is decreasing. We started at 3 and now we're at 0.75. And remember, a low surface to volume ratio, so let's indicate that. That's a lower number. That's a low surface to volume ratio. will not allow a cell to exchange materials with the environment as efficient as what it needs to. The smaller cell has that high surface to volume ratio. So you can see from the numbers that we calculated, as the cell grows, the surface to volume ratio decreases. On this page, we're going to tackle the surface area and the volume formulas that are on your formula sheet. And we're going to go through some examples so you know how to calculate surface to volume ratio of objects that have different shapes, like spheres versus cubes versus columns. So take a second to familiarize yourself with some of these equations that I have over here. This is a section from the AP formula sheet that I cut and pasted into your notes. So let's work some examples. I've seen questions where students have to calculate surface area and volume and the surface to volume ratio of cells. And some students are stumped right from the beginning because they don't see over here on the formula sheet, they don't see cells. Well, you have to understand that you're talking about a sphere. So here's a sphere. And a circular cell is going to be considered a sphere. So if you're asked to calculate the volume of a cell, you need to understand that this is the equation that you're going to use. If you need to calculate the surface area of the sphere, then there's your equation that you're going to use. So let's go ahead and indicate these formulas. So to calculate surface area, it's 4 pi r squared, and that r means radius. And if you didn't know that, it's defined for you there. And volume is 4/3 pi r cubed. Now, I want to note that radius is the distance from the inside of the object to the perimeter. The whole distance across this object from here to here is considered the diameter. So you have to watch for if they're giving you the radius or they're giving you the diameter. If they just give you the diameter, you need to cut it in half, and then you're going to have the radius. Now let's plug in our numbers. 4 and pi is 3.14. Radius is 11.2 in this example. Remember I said we're calculating surface area, we're going to be squaring numbers. So I like to square the numbers first and get that value, which is 125. And if I multiply those together, I'm going to get 1,575. For volume, we have 4/3. Pi is 3.14. Radius, again, is 11.2 centimeters. But remember that we have to cube it. When we cube that number, we get 1,405. Note, you're not going to have a fancy calculator on the AP exam. You're going to have a 4-function calculator. So you need to make sure that you can multiply these numbers using a very simple calculator. So to do that, I multiply 1,405 by 3.14. And this 4/3 means take that number and times it by 4 and then divide it by 3. And whenever you do that, you're going to get 5,882. Note that there's no formula on your formula sheet for calculating surface to volume ratio. You have to understand that when you say surface to volume ratio, that we're talking about surface area divided by the volume. So in this case, the surface area is 1,575. The volume was 5,882. And that gives you a surface to volume ratio of 0.26. Now, if you want to know about the units, surface area was in centimeters squared, volume was in centimeters cubed, and those units stay. So it's centimeters squared per centimeters cubed. The good news is on the AP exam, you won't have to indicate units. Whereas I'm not sure if that's the case for some of your AP math classes. You might have a way to indicate unit. But for the AP test, this would be an example of a grid-in question. And all you have to do is grid in 0.26, and you don't have to indicate units. Okay, moving on. Let's calculate the surface to volume ratio of some objects with different shapes. So here we have a cube, and referring back to, move this back down. Referring back to our formula sheet here, it says that the surface area of a cube, right there, is 6a. So let's make sure you understand what that means. So area equals 6a. You have some help because it says A is the surface area of one side of the cube. So let's see if this makes sense. Remember, surface area is what you can touch on this cube. It's on the outside. So you have to calculate the surface area of this side, and then you have to calculate the surface area of this side, and so on, and there's 6 sides to a cube. So it's simply saying, because you have a cube, just calculate the surface area of one side, so that A is the surface area of one side, so SA of one side, and then just multiply that number by 6 because you have 6 sides and they all have the same area. It's not on the formula sheet, but I hope you know that to calculate area, it's length times width. So the length of one side is 5 centimeters. The width, let's talk about this side right here. So length is 5 centimeters, width is 5 centimeters. So your surface area of one side is going to be 25 centimeters squared. And there's 6 sides, so we take 6 times 25 centimeters squared. And that equals 150 centimeters squared. I'm going to rewrite that. 150 centimeters squared. Here's your equation for the volume of a cube. So it's length times width times height. So we have length, so we can call this length. We can call this the width, and you can tell that that's going to be 5 centimeters. And then we have the height. You can tell that's 5 centimeters as well. So 5 times 5 times 5 gives you 125 centimeters cubed. So now that we have our surface area and we have our volume, then we can calculate the surface to volume ratio. 150 centimeters squared divided by 125 centimeters cubed. And that gives us 1.2 centimeters squared per centimeters cubed. For the next example, we're going to calculate the surface to volume ratio of a square column. So I'm just going to indicate the equations that we're going to use. So here we have the volume of a square column. Again, is just going to be length times width times height. And when we have a square column, we're going to have some rectangles. So if we're trying to calculate the surface area of a rectangular solid, then this is the equation that we're going to use. We're going to find the surface area of each side, and then we have to add them together so that we are compensating for those 6 sides of this rectangular solid or of this square column. So those are the 2 equations that we're going to refer to. Let's write those down. The surface of this rectangular column is the area equals the sum, so that crazy E means sum, of the surface area of each side. We're going to calculate the surface area of each side, and we're going to add those together to find the total surface area. So let's focus on that first. Let's calculate the surface area of one side. Let's start over here. So remember, surface area is length times width. So if this is considered the width, then this can be the length, which is 6 centimeters. So we have 6 times 11 centimeters, and that gives us 66. Now, let's study this object real quick, and you can see that this side looks just like this side, which looks just like this side, and also the top. So there's 4 different sides that have the exact same surface area. So I'm going to take that number we found, times it by 4 sides, and that gives us 264 centimeters squared. And now we have to calculate the surface area of the ends. So these areas right here. So we have 6 times 6. That's the length and that's the width. So 6 times 6 gives us 36. And there's 2 sides. Here's one end. Here's the other end. So I'm going to multiply that number by 2 sides. And that gives us 72 centimeters squared. The equation says we have to add those up. We have to sum them. So I like to do this. Some old school math there. When we sum those together, we're going to get 336 centimeters squared. So there's our surface area. I didn't leave much room for volume here, but It's an easy calculation. Volume is length times width times height. So we have 6 times 6 times 11, which gives us 396 centimeters cubed. So let's take 336 centimeters squared divided by 396 centimeters cubed, and that gives us a surface area of 0.85 centimeters squared over centimeters cubed. And for the last example, we're going to look at a circular column. Now, a situation where you might have to use these equations, or where you're going to have an object that has this shape, is maybe a specialized type of cell like a muscle cell. Muscle cells are not round, like when you think of skin cells, or your typical animal cell that you've seen diagrams of since the 5th grade. Muscle cells look more like this. They're very long and skinny. They're a circular column. So let's take a look at the formulas that relate to this shape. The only equation that we haven't used yet is this one right here. So that gives us the volume of this column, this circular column. But if you notice, there's no equation that tells you how to calculate the surface area of a column. Because you're not given this equation, then there's no way that you're going to be able to calculate the surface to volume ratio. This isn't a question that you're ever going to see on the AP exam, because they're not providing you the formula. Now, in the question prompt, they might give you the formula, and then you'd have to calculate the surface to volume ratio. But right now, the only thing that we can calculate is the volume. So according to the equation sheet, the volume formula is pi r squared times the height. So let's go ahead and do that so you're familiar with it. Again, pi is 3.14. The radius, and you got to check to make sure they're giving you the radius and not the diameter. It is 4, and we're going to square that number. And here's your height, 8. So I like to do my square roots first. So that's 16. So when I multiply 3.14 times 16 times 8, I get 402 centimeters cubed. Let's visit one more concept related to surface to volume ratio, and then I'm going to show you an example of another question where there are some calculations involving changes in a cell size over time. To review, plants need a high surface to volume ratio to efficiently exchange materials with the environment. Now, let's relate this to a plant cell. And you remember we talked about plant cells have large vacuoles because they need to store a lot of water. Now, consider how the volume or the contents of the cell is altered by the fact that there's a really large structure in the middle of the cell. By having this really large vacuole, it actually reduces the volume of the contents of the cell. There's less room for mitochondria and chloroplasts. There's less cytoplasm because of the really large vacuole. So as a result of this really large structure in the cell, this vacuole, the surface to volume ratio of this plant cell is increased. So the plant cell vacuole increases the surface to volume ratio, and it does that by decreasing the volume of the cytosol of the cell, or the contents of the cell. So again, if we're increasing surface to volume ratio, that means we're developing a high surface to volume ratio, and that is what is needed by cells. Now, let's relate this top statement to an idea about formulas. When we're calculating surface to volume ratio, that means that we have a number on top, we have surface area on top, and we have a number on the bottom that represents volume. And then our answer over here, that's going to be the ratio. If you alter this bottom number, if I decrease the volume, because that's what's happening by this large vacuole being inside the plant cell, is we're actually decreasing the volume and the contents of the cell. So we're lowering the volume. Do you know what's going to happen to this number on the other side of the equal sign, to the ratio? Well, whatever you do to the denominator, remember the bottom number is the denominator, whatever you do to the denominator, the opposite is going to happen to your answer. So if you decrease the volume, then that's going to increase this number. That's going to increase the surface to volume ratio. So let's relate this to if volume is increased. So again, we have surface area on the top. We have volume on the bottom. If we increase the volume of a cell, that's going to create this unfavorable situation for a cell. Because if we increase this bottom number, then it's going to decrease this surface to volume ratio. And we need cells with a high surface to volume ratio. If I'm recalling right, in our inquiry unit, we talked about how to calculate how many times greater or how many times smaller. So since we're talking about cell size, I want to show you an equation where you would have to relate cell size to this idea of how many times greater or how many times smaller. So before I do this for you, why don't you hit pause and read through the question and see if you can come up with an answer on your own. Whenever you're calculating how many times larger or how many times smaller, you're actually getting a ratio. So if the problem asks you to calculate how many times larger, then you need to put the larger number on top, and you need to divide it by the small number. So let's use a simple example. Say that I'm 36 years old and you're 18. So how many times older am I than you? You can probably do that in your head. I'm twice as old, so my answer is 2. I'm 2 times older than you. So if you think about it, to make that calculation, we took my age, which is 36. It's not really 36, FYI. And we divided it by your age, which is 18, and our answer was 2. If I asked how many times younger are you than me, or how many times smaller, then we're going to put the small number on top, and we're going to divide it by the big number. And in your head, you're probably thinking that you're half my age. So half is 0.5, so we should get 0.5 as the answer. So we have 18 divided by 36, and we do that, we get 0.5. But AP likes to put other angles to questions. So here we have a graph, and first you have to interpret the graph. You have to figure out 2 data points, and then you have to plug those into an equation. But I want to point out there's no formula on your formula sheet for calculating how many times larger or how many times greater and how many times smaller. So you're just going to have to remember that this is how you calculate it. So the question says, the following graph shows the change in the cell's diameter over time. How many times larger is the cell's diameter at day 5? So let's get that number. And it's 11 compared to the cell's diameter on day 1, which is 5. So again, we're trying to calculate how many times larger. So we're going to use this formula right here. So we have 11 divided by 5. And you can tell that on day 5, it's about twice as big as what's on day 1. So our number should be around 2. And when we divide 11 by 5, it gives us 2.2. So there's our correct answer. Here's an example of a calculation where you're calculating how many times greater in regards to cells, but they can do this in any of the units. I've seen questions like, how many times greater is the population at day 2 compared to day 10? Or how many times smaller is the energy at level 1 compared to the energy at level 3 when we're talking about the energy pyramid. In biochemistry, how many times greater is the reaction rate at minute 1 compared to minute 2? In photosynthesis and respiration, I've seen a question like this. And of course, in typical AP fashion, they throw a lot of additional details in there to try to confuse you, but it's a really simple concept. You're finding the bigger number on a graph and you're dividing it by the smaller number on the graph. You just have to read the graph carefully. So now you have a few calculations to make on your review worksheet that you were given last class.